how many of you have made the grave error of getting like a dog for a pet? Poor judgment, every one of you. I'm completely serious. It's one of my total rules in the house is like, even if my wife comes home with a kitten or a puppy, I will look it right in its cute, limpid eyes, and then I will take it to the pound, and I will say, put it down. This animal serves no purpose, no utility. I'm with Dwight Schrute on this one. Not exactly that, but if you've ever raised a puppy or you've ever gotten a little kitten, you know that what is required to raise a badly behaved puppy that chews up everything in sight, pees on the living room carpet, and barks at passersby all day, every day, is just nothing. That's all you have to do. And you will get a grown dog that is a complete terror on the neighborhood, inside and outside your home, it doesn't matter. A dog that should be put down, to be honest. Just saying. Same thing if you're looking at a garden in your backyard. What's required to build or to grow a garden box full of thistles or dandelions or bindweed? And the answer again is basically nothing. So if you take that principle and you look at your children, what is required to raise children who become the kind of adults that you would like to avoid spending time with as much as possible? The pathway is very similar. Right? Obviously, there are different ways that you could destroy a garden or a puppy or a child than simply doing nothing. For example, abusive parents who get drunk and beat on their children are not doing nothing, and they are also destroying their children. Parents who neglect their children entirely or belittle and verbally abuse them are obviously doing all they can to destroy their children. But there's another way to destroy your children that's much less visible, but it's still evil. In fact, the scriptures call it hatred. They call it hatred. You hate your child if you parent them this way. And you can, live out this form of hatred very comfortably. And most people in our society, most parents won't look at you and notice much, at least not consistently. Proverbs 13:24 says, whoever spares the rod hates his son, but he who loves him is diligent to discipline him. So we can say that refusal to or neglect of biblical discipline is hatred of your children. So when Paul commands us in Ephesians 6:4, fathers, raise up your children in the paideia of Christ rather than provoking them to wrath, we can assume that one way we might provoke them to wrath is just to fail to discipline them consistently and according to biblical standards. So this morning, taking up this topic of discipline, we'll try to do three basic things. And the first thing is to try and understand what discipline is and is not. What is discipline? What isn't discipline? And we'll have 5 headings there. You can count these up so you can see the total number of points. It is fewer than 25 this week. Second, we'll work through a practicum on discipline, aiming to understand how to carry these things out practically in the moment, day to day. And then third and finally, we'll deal with some what we'll call miscellany, just aspects of discipline that are specific, situational, and common to our context that don't fit neatly under those other 2 categories, but I think might be important for us specifically. So first, what is discipline anyway? What is and isn't discipline? And again, 5 headings on this point. The first is that discipline is discipleship. Discipline is discipleship. And so it necessarily requires an end goal in mind, a standard to which we aim to see our children conformed. That's what discipleship ultimately is. Discipleship is functionally where someone says to a teacher, a rabbi, a mentor, whatever you want to call it, I would like to be more like you. And so you would follow that person around, you would meet with that person, you would say, teach me what it is in your life that makes your life look the way that it is. I would like my life to imitate your life. And so teach me how you deal with money and how you deal with faith and how you deal with marriage and parenting and all these different things. And so even though the disciple will be himself at the end, and he'll be visibly himself and not the mentor, the goal is that he would become more like the mentor, right? Think of Jesus' 12 disciples following him for 3 years. He was teaching them to be like himself. Ultimately, all Christian discipleship has the aim of becoming like Christ. We're trying to become like a person. So you can see why when you understand discipleship holistically like that, you see that things like, well, just a few rules or methods or strategies, it won't be enough because we're trying to become a person. Everything that they are, what they love, their instincts, what they say. We want to talk like them. We want to think like them. We want to love the things they love and hate the things that they hate. And so Christian discipleship ultimately finds its aim in becoming like Christ. And this happens through, humanly speaking, through imitating other people as well who are not Christ. Right? Paul said that the church was to imitate him as he imitated Christ. Because when you think about Christ, he's not in front of me the same way that Paul would have been to them, or that maybe your father or your mother or your friend or a pastor might be. And so it's helpful, humanly speaking, to have visible human models in front of you that are to represent Christ to the disciple. Paul functioned this way, pastors function this way, and parents function this way. When we discipline our children, we're aiming to correct the course where they were becoming less like Christ, so that we can say, not that way, if you want to be like Christ, but this way. So that requires a standard. The standard is not ours to invent, but it's ours to discover and apply in wisdom to our context. So this is important because this excludes a lot of false ways or paths to discipline. If we're disciplining towards conformity to Christ, that means that we're not free to invent what Christ looks like. Christ is who he is. He loves what he loves. He hates what he hates. He is righteous. He is not unrighteous. And so we don't invent the standard for our children's discipleship. We don't say, for example, my goal from the time that my child is born is I'm going to make him a great football player. Well, maybe not. It's not really your goal. Your goal is to make him look like Christ. And maybe he, turns out to be 6'4" and 270 pounds of pure muscle and makes a really good, I don't know what that, I just described what position they'd be good at. Rolling back? I'm just kidding. I know it's a running back. All right, don't make fun of me. If watching men in spandex wrestle each other is your thing, you might correct me on that. No, we're not trying to make our child some kind of mold of our own invention. We're trying to see them conformed by grace and through faith, through the means that God has appointed into the image of Christ. So that gives us an end destination right there from the beginning that we can filter much of our practical discipline through, where they have walked not according to that way. And I'm going to come with correction, and I'm going to relocate them towards that path. That's what discipline is. They've wandered, I'm going to bring them back. They're acting not like Christ. I'm going to correct them and bring them to act like Christ. Number 2, the goal of discipline at the end is to make free men and free women. We're trying to make free men and free women, not legalists or libertines. The scriptures say that where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. And yet at the same time, Paul regularly calls himself a doulos of Christ, which means literally a slave of Christ. Christ says that we can only serve one master, not two. We'll either serve some other god, money or mammon or sex or whatever it is, or our Father. So really at the end of the day, the path of Christian discipleship presupposes that you will be a slave of something. So why am I saying that the goal is freedom? That the goal is to make free men and free women? Wouldn't I want to say our goal is to make slaves of Christ? Well, I repeat myself. To make a slave of Christ is to make a free man and a free woman. Because what your child was made by God to be is a slave of Christ, is a man or a woman who finds their deepest core identity in being and doing what God has made them to be and do. To serve God, to point all of their strength at the glory of God. So we're trying to make slaves of Christ because slaves of Christ are the only men and women who can ultimately be free instead of being enslaved to some lesser god. Slavery to Christ is freedom, but slavery to any other god is slavery. If our children grow up and they're not slaves to Christ, but let's say they're slaves to money, they will be maybe highly successful, maybe very respectable men and women. Maybe other people will look at them and think we did a great job, but ultimately we can still have failed utterly because they worship money. Well, maybe they're very put together, self-disciplined. Maybe they have a good job, they're stable. Maybe they even have a family and their own children. Maybe they go to church every week. And yet, maybe underneath all of that, the altar at the center of their cultus, at the center of their heart, is to money, to success, to the praise of men. The Pharisees were an example of men who looked like they had succeeded. They looked like they wildly succeeded, the most respectable men in the nation, and yet they were actually utterly enslaved to their own passions. They were utterly enslaved to the love of people and their praise. They feared people, not God. We're trying to make free men and free women, and so we're going to avoid two ditches on either side of the road. One is legalism. Legalism is righteousness that is sought apart from faith. It's one way that we might become a legalist, where we seek righteousness by our own strength apart from faith in Christ. Legalism might also be a set of laws that are established in worship of a different God, right? Where we can very legalistically establish all sorts of rules that God did not establish, and then we can discipline our children to obey those rules. And at the end of the day, those rules are going to say, be like this God. And if that God is not the true God, then what we're teaching them is legalism. Often in parenting, the way that this works out is that mom and dad become the God, especially in the young years, and their comfort and praise and glory is the overriding principle they're correcting to. So they say very legalistically, thou shalt not interrupt dad when he is watching TV. And that becomes a law. Well, they can enforce that law with discipline. They could even use biblical methods of discipline. But is that discipline going to conform them to Christ? No. It's going to conform them to the image of the God, which is the dad, the lazy, abdicating dad. Or mom. Maybe the law of the house is, thou shalt not ask mom for anything ever because it's annoying. Well, yeah, they're going to become conformed to the image of some God, but the God is going to be the mom who is worshiping her own comfort. Legalism is not a pathway towards saving or seeing our children conform to the image of Christ. It will ultimately conform them to the image of some other God, because those laws will not be the laws of God, but our own laws of our own making. Or another way we might pursue legalism with our children is by making it very obvious that we don't care at all about what they in their heart believe or desire. We just care about them presenting the correct front, right? So the rule might be like, you can say whatever you want. You can, have all the language of the neighborhood kids when you're playing outside. But if somebody is over at our house, don't use those words. Don't use those, because that would puncture the bubble of my image, right? Where we're saying, you're now going to just aim for dead or empty or wooden externalism with our children. Again, we talked about this last week. This is like aiming for making children who are whitewashed tombs full of dead men's bones. Legalism is not what we're aiming for. We're aiming for liberty. Liberty where they have the right laws and they love them because they recognize the wisdom of them. And so they pursue obedience to those laws from their heart. Over time, our children grow to love our law because they recognize that our law, mom and dad's law, is an expression of God's law, and it brings them freedom. That when they listen to us, they become respectable men and women, young men and young women, who know how to handle themselves competently and courageously in the world. And that when they do what mom and dad said, it goes well for them. Financially, it goes well for them in their relationship with their friends and their schooling, ultimately in their work and their marriages. They see mom and dad's law as good and right because it is an expression of God's law. The other thing we're not aiming for is liberty, not license. One fake version of liberty, freedom, is license, where we teach our children that they are allowed to do whatever they want because we're not going to impose our will on them. Where they're just, free-range children, and not in the good way, not in the not overprotective bubble wrap fear farm parenting, but just go and do whatever you want, watch whatever you want, follow your heart. And what you'll find if you do this today is that what their heart wants is to play Minecraft for 8 to 12 hours a day. If they're a young man, or, so I don't know what the little girls are doing, because I only have little boys, and they're always talking about Minecraft, or watch like some dumb thing on Netflix. That's what they want to do all the time. You'll find that their hearts, because Their hearts are bent, twisted by sin, that if they're not corrected and corralled by the loving discipline of their parents, then a fake liberty, which is just license to sin without correction, will lead them ultimately to destruction. So we want to train our children and train their affections so that they would say yes to what God says yes to and no to what God says no to, because they love God's law, they see the glory in it, and they see that God's law is freedom. Where do our children get liberty? There's only one place. It's through Christ. Our children can only find liberty through slavery to Christ. That's it. And they're only going to find Christ through the gospel of Christ. And so our parenting, our discipline is going to be cruciform. It's going to press our children to the cross where their sin can be dealt with, where they can see the severity of their sin, where their sin can be dealt with, and they can have a clean conscience and be restored to fellowship with God and with their brother and with mom and dad and with their neighbor. And then they can go out in freedom, knowing that the cliff over there is not actually freedom, it's death. That cliff is just death. What I wanted to do, what I just toyed with, what I was looking over the edge of, that was death. And mom and dad helped me. But they helped me not legalistically, they helped me through the cross. I really like what Pastor Douglas Wilson wrote here on this subject in his book, Why Children Matter, which is a great book. It's very short, and you could read it to much benefit, whether you've been a parent for 10 minutes or years. He said, liberty was purchased for us by Christ on the cross, not by our shifts and evasions. The righteousness of liberty outdoes the legalist, and the joy of liberty outdoes the libertine. The righteousness of liberty outdoes the legalist. We will make children who are far more moral by pointing them to Christ than if we merely tried to rigidly get them to obey externally. Legalism. But the joy of liberty in Christ outdoes the libertine. The joy of somebody who's self-disciplined over time will far outstrip the joy of somebody who is enslaved to their sin. Our children will be miserable if we let them play Minecraft for 8 to 12 hours a day. They will be losers. They will be men and women with whom you would not want to spend time, who are utterly uninteresting, and failures. They won't have joy, even though in the moment they're doing what the dopamine says they should do. What am I on? 3. Discipline ultimately is love. What is discipline? Discipline is love. Remember what I quoted at the beginning in Proverbs 13, whoever spares the rod, that's discipline, hates his son, but he who loves him is diligent to discipline him. We know that discipline is love because this is what God says here in Proverbs, but also because this is what God says about his own disciplining of his own children, of us. He says that he disciplines us because we are true sons. He looks at us and he says, I've adopted this person through Christ, and so I will correct them progressively, gently, through the gospel, by the Spirit, by faith, in accordance with his law. He'll correct us. Sometimes it's painful. Often it's painful. No discipline is pleasant in the moment. Why? Because he loves us. It's the son that doesn't get disciplined that is not beloved. It's the one who is not the son of the Father, who is not beloved, who is left to follow his own, go thou and do what you will. Go follow your heart. Discipline is ultimately love. It's very easy to get this twisted up as parents and to forget this. To forget that when we're disciplining our children, even though we're giving them pain, and we'll talk about this, discipline is pain in a sense. Discipline is about pain. Well, we're actually loving them by hurting them. Someone's going to clip that out on the internet. I'm looking at you. Don't do it. Put it in context with the clip. But it really is. If we don't hurt our children, if we don't bring the sting of correction to our children, ultimately what we're saying is, I would like you to feel the much greater, deeper sting of this sin fully grown. I want you to continue in this sin. I would like you to be miserable and die. Because I won't correct this little lie here. I want that lie to grow up until it's a great tree of lies, putting down deep roots in your heart and corrupting every aspect of your person. I hate you, and I want you to be destroyed. And so instead, we're coming in love, and we're introducing a small, sharp pain to say, don't go that way. Don't go that way. It's like, they have those little electric wires around pens where you might keep cattle or sheep or pigs. And it's not a harmful little charge of electricity, But when the pig or the sheep or the cow gets to that, they run into it a few times, they stop running into it, and they go, man, the farmer really doesn't like me. He's surrounded me by pain. And what he doesn't know is that there's a freeway with semis hurtling past at 80 miles an hour, about half a mile away from that fence. And then if they go past that fence and onto that freeway, they are going to become ground beef in a very unpleasant way. That's how we love our children. We correct them. We say, don't go off the cliff. Discipline is love. Number 4, discipline is also pain. We're going to unpack this in the practical section, so I won't be exhaustive here in this minute, but number 4, discipline is pain. Again, is the introduction of a small simulated pain that is supposed to simulate what the sin you're correcting will feel like fully grown. That's what we're doing when we're disciplining. And so discipline that has no pain in it is often false discipline. And I don't mean that you should be spanking your 17-year-old. We'll talk about that. I don't mean that. But pain is still a part of it. No discipline is pleasant in the moment. And so when my 14, 15, 16-year-old is sinning, I might be removing privileges and responsibilities, and I'm simulating, I'm saying, you're acting like you're not old enough and self-ruled enough to have these responsibilities. And so I'm going to now treat you for a period of time like a 10-year-old and not a 14-year-old. I'm going to rule you with greater external barriers because you have not demonstrated in this sin that you can have those barriers removed and not go off the cliff. Simulated pain, whether it's spanking spoon or removal of privileges or responsibilities, etc. Number 5, lastly, discipline is not about retribution. Discipline is not about retribution. Discipline is about correction. And this is a very important distinction. It's a very important distinction. It's easy to confuse the two because they have similarities, right? Retribution is also about pain. Like, going to prison is painful. You don't want to go to prison. You don't want to be put in front of a firing squad. You don't want to be fined and have to pay a fine or to make restitution fourfold for what you've stolen. Justice in the civil sphere is about retribution, but discipline in the family sphere is about correction. So when the civil government, when the prince wields the sword to the wrongdoer in the civil sphere and maybe says, you deserve death, and I pronounce the sentence of death upon you, in 24 hours you'll be hung at dawn, right? When he does that, he's not aiming to correct the wrongdoer. It's not therapeutic. He's not saying, well, maybe this beheading will help him turn over another leaf. When he sends him to prison for 5 or 10 years, the primary goal ought not to be about rehabilitation. It's retribution. We're saying, you deserve this. Fundamentally, the law is a matter of lex talionis, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Proportionate pain, proportionate consequence for a proportionate wrong. It's not about correction. Now, of course, we would hope to come alongside and help the person who is the wrongdoer. We want to see them rehabilitated. That might be secondary, tertiary aims along the way, but the primary thing about civil punishment is not correction, it's retribution. Our children, though, we are not seeking to punish them or seek retribution. We're actually seeking to correct them. Instead of being punisher and protector of society, we're coming alongside and we're being mentor, teacher, father. We're saying, no, don't do this. I'm now going to help you to not do that in the future, not to bring retribution, not to make you pay back your sin, but to help you grow so that you will not be the kind of man or the kind of woman who sins that way. I'm trying to make you a different kind of person. Discipline is not about retribution. It's about correction. Let's get into some the practicum side, practical how-to. And here I have somewhere between, let's say 7 points roughly. Number 1, practically speaking, it's much more helpful to enforce a few root laws with disciplined consistency than to try and enforce 10,000 out at the end of the branches kind of laws with disciplined consistency. And so when we're focusing on correcting our children, for their sake and for ours, instead of trying to come up with a list of 613 laws that we're going to enforce in our home, we ought to have fewer that boil down to principles that can be applied in 613 ways or beyond. Fewer principles, fewer rules, but more foundational rules, more foundational principles. This isn't just a random life hack or pro tip, right? Like as if the only reason for this kind of, tactic in parenting is because it's easier to remember 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 rules in your house than 17 or 25. That's true practically. But there's a reason it's true, and it's because this is what God is like. This is what God's law is like. It's not just a random life hack. It's one of the most central features of biblical justice, and even the world that biblical justice built in the West. Our legal system still operates on a case law basis, where judges and courts, and legislators as well, but judges and courts primarily, are looking for root principles to use to adjudicate literally millions of different scenarios. And the goal in this judicial work is not to figure out a law for every possible way that you could commit a crime. The laws then would look something like no driving your 1996 Ford Escort into a group of nuns crossing the crosswalk on a Tuesday morning at 8:43 a.m., to which you could stand up in court and say, well, Your Honor, I actually hit them at 8:44, so this law clearly doesn't apply. And they say, dang it, got to call the Senate again. We got to get another law passed at 8:44. What were you thinking? Or, it was actually an Escalade. It wasn't an Escort. And so, again, I'm off the hook. Well, obviously, no. Obviously, no. There's a deeper legal principle that is ultimately in our juridical system built on thou shalt not murder. It's built on the 10 commandments. Thou shalt not murder. And so, obviously, the application is there are a million different ways to murder somebody. And so, a judge in wisdom is going to try and discern, or a judge and a jury are going to try to discern whether a specific act was murder or manslaughter or legal defense or some other category. Someone died and you did it. Was it illegal or not? It's going to come down to the principle. We can go even deeper than that. Even the law, thou shalt not murder, is an application of a deeper legal principle in Scripture. Namely, according to Jesus, you shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. According to Jesus, those 2 laws, and actually he even sums them up with just the one of love your neighbor as yourself elsewhere. Those 2 laws, those 2 principles sum up the law and prophets with respect to justice. He's showing us ultimately that justice is to do one thing that looks like 10 million other things, not to do 10 million things. Justice ultimately is to do the one thing of looking like God. Ultimately, what is justice? It is properly reflecting in any given scenario the character, the unchanging, holy, holy, holy character of God. All of the law is summed up in that. Be holy, for God is holy. So our children don't actually need 15,000 laws, which they simply will not remember anyway, but they need a few memorable biblical and foundational principles and laws that can be applied in countless ways. The way that we generally land this, like many of you, and like many other families, you've probably heard this in 15 other parenting books, but it remains very, very good counsel. Very simple 3 rules in our house. One is no fussing, pouting, or grumping about. And maybe I won't say that whole sentence every time. But you're not free to walk around and make everybody else's life miserable by being tremendously grumpy. Why? Well, I'm not hurting anybody. Well, actually, yes, you are. You're failing to love your neighbor as yourself. There's the principle. Because would you want to live with somebody who's in a high dudgeon at all times? Would you want to live with a tremendously porcupine-like person your entire life in close proximity? No, of course not. So no fussing, pouting, or grumping about. Number 2, obey lawful authorities right away, all the way, with a happy heart. With a young child, it might just be obey mom or obey dad, all the way, right away, with a happy heart. But the full-grown adult version of this law, which I am still called to obey, is to obey lawful authorities right away, all the way, with a happy heart. And we could add, insofar as it's within their jurisdiction. So when I relate to the civil magistrate, to a judge, I am called to obey the command not to murder my fellow Ogdenite. That's a good law. And if I do murder him, then that judge will be perfectly just, even if he's a total pagan, to send me to some civil punishment. Hopefully death, but probably not, because our legal system is basically a bunch of pansies. Lawful authorities are to be obeyed right away, all the way with a happy heart. That might look like a pastor or an elder giving you a lawful command within the scope of their authority, like stop committing adultery, or stop dividing the church, or etc. It might be a boss at your workplace that you have said, I will work for you and I will follow your policies and I will be under your authority. And if you don't do that, then you're actually sinning. Obey lawful authorities. For our children, obey mom and dad right away, all the way with a happy heart. Not after the 5th time, not grumping about in a high dudgeon, see rule number 1, but right away, all the way with a happy heart. Number 3, respect lawful authorities appropriately, or give honor to lawful authorities appropriately. And again, the way that this translates to our children is something like respect mom, respect dad, respect Pastor Burkholder, respect our guests that are in our house. They are in a position of some kind of lawful authority or superiority, and you owe them honor. And so you are not allowed to be disrespectful to mom and dad. Even if you go and you do everything mom said, if you do so while grumping and also muttering under your breath about how dumb mom is for asking you to do this, you're clearly violating all 3 rules at once. And so those laws, those rules tend to capture 99.9% of discipline scenarios that you'll find yourself in with your children. Typically, your child will be breaking more than one of them at a time. But it's not difficult for you to point at one of those consistently and say, Mom and dad asked you to unload the dishwasher after dinner. And you responded, I unload the dishwasher in the morning. That's my brother's job. I unloaded the dishwasher yesterday. I have music homework to do. I want to go play outside. No. What is the correct answer? Yes, ma'am. Go unload the dishwasher. Or it could be, yes, ma'am, and a wise appeal. Yes, ma'am. Could I finish my music homework before? I'm working on it right now. And then right after that? Well, you said you're going to do it with a happy heart, and then you're making a wise appeal, and maybe mom will say, no, I have reasons that, the dishwasher needs to be unloaded, so I can load it while you finish music homework. There can be communication both ways. It's not robots, but it needs to be respectful communication that has a willingness to submit. Number 2, when those laws are violated practically, discipline right away as often as possible. Right away. First offense. As often as possible, swiftly and consistently. The scriptures warn us that when justice is delayed, it increases wrongdoing. Don't wait until the 5th offense. This helps you because it will help you discipline while you're at peak self-control. Because when your child has sinned 5 times, you're more likely to be frustrated than when they sin once. When they're yelling at you, and now they're up in this high dudgeon kind of disrespectful, they're melting down in tears. Trust me, as one who confesses this sin regularly while kneeling in this church on Sunday mornings, it is much easier to lose your temper and to raise your voice and to lose your moral high ground. Helps you discipline with calmness. It also helps your children not learn a lie. Because no matter what rules you have written on the fridge, maybe you have those 3 rules translated into kid language and they're up on your fridge, or maybe you've gone biblical and you've inscribed them in tablets of stone and given a copy to each of your children. Here's your copy of the law. Here's your copy of the law. You are to read it and copy it out once a year. You are to have it on your heart, bind it on your forehead. So here's the law. Doesn't matter what you have written down if you enforce something different. The real law is the one you enforce. There are probably still laws on the books that forbid homosexual sexual acts in different places in America, but they're not enforced, so they're not laws. Our child might learn that the actual rule is only disobey 5 times, not 6. If we only spank them on the 6th, 7th, 8th, what they're really learning is that the law is only disobey 5 times. You're good. You disobey 5 times, and then you got to get away quick enough before the 6th one comes. Well, if that's how you discipline, that is the rule. That is the law. So discipline right away as often as possible. Number 3, discipline is managed pain, because that's what will grow out of the root of sin, pain. And so you must make your discipline unpleasant. Don't try to have your cake and eat it too. Don't try to make your discipline like this really mutually nice, where you take your kid aside and you bounce them on your knee and you stroke their hair and you say, would you like a cookie while we have this conversation? And mommy and daddy really prefer it if you would reconsider your tone when talking to guests. And what you really need to say is, you're not allowed to throw your full plate of food at our guests, yell at mom about how the dinner is disgusting and you're not going to eat it, and flee the table without being excused. Well, gentle parenting probably won't do it there. Probably won't do the trick there. Why? Because what's the error? The error is that discipline doesn't need to involve pain. Or the pain can be cloaked under 6 million layers of varnish until they don't even notice the pain. Distracted with a lollipop while they get the shot. No, the pain is the point. The pain is at the heart of what the discipline actually is. You have to understand that. You're loving your child by giving them this small simulated pain. So don't be ashamed of that, right? Don't let the comments on this YouTube video, which are probably going to be from gentle parent advocates, who are like, you're such a bad person, you child abuser. I'd say, no, you're a child abuser. You hate your children because you won't give them small pain. You want them to have big pain. You want them to have that pain fully grown. You don't want them to be in fellowship with God, with mom and dad, with their brothers and sisters, and with their neighbor. You want them to be at enmity with God and not even know it. If we love our children, we will give them simulated, self-controlled, it's important, manageable pain. There is such thing as child abuse, and it is damnable. Don't do it. You're not beating your children. We're not injuring our children. Even a spanking that's properly done with a light wooden spoon that stings is not damaging or injuring your child. If you're wailing on them and you're deeply injuring them, hurting them, leaving, black bruises on your children, then you're sinning and you need to repent. You need to come talk to an elder and we need to figure that out, right? If you're yelling and screaming at your children, you say, well, it hurts them, it's pain. Pastor Brian said pain was good. Well, no. Not that kind of pain. Self-controlled pain administered by someone who is morally qualified and in proper authority. Meaning that when you are in control of yourself and you're not doing it out of rage but out of love, give them the small manageable pain in a self-controlled way, and you help them work through restoration of fellowship. I don't mean you have to walk them through the entire liturgy of the gospel every time you correct your children. Some people say that every time you correct them, you have to share the gospel with them. Not actually all the time. You should have, especially if you're seeing a pattern in your children, sit them down, have that conversation with them, say, yes, son, yes, daughter, I've noticed that we've had to correct you for lying 10 times this week. Do you know what happens to a liar? You know what happens to someone who lies a lot? Well, people think they're a liar. Do you want to be a liar? No, okay. Your sin is separating you from mom and dad. It's losing our trust. Your siblings too. Your teachers too. You need to be in fellowship with God. Here's how. Repent of that sin. Trust in Christ. Here's some verses to help you come to mind, to bring to mind when you're tempted to lie. Psalm 119, etc. Bring them the help of the gospel. Discipline is managed pain. Number 4, as I said, you must be in control of yourself. Galatians 6:1 says, if a brother is caught in a trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness, keeping watch on yourself, lest you be tempted. Galatians 6:1, foundational church discipline and parenting passage that you should memorize. Essentially, more times than they talk about the sin you're correcting, they talk about your own watchfulness. You are spiritual. Okay, are you morally qualified? Are you walking in fellowship with God right now? Are you doing it gently? A spanking is consistent with gently, by the way. Still gently. Are you keeping watch for sin? Jesus warns us in the Sermon on the Mount not to take the speck out of our brother's eye with a log jammed as our own. So we're never trying to say, do as I say, not as I do, because that simply won't work. Simply won't work. Our children learn much more by our words, by imitation, which is actually a pattern. It's a design feature of discipleship. Paul said, imitate me as I imitate Christ. Paul said, be imitators of God as beloved children. Why? Because beloved children imitate their parents. Children imitate their parents. They don't just regurgitate what their parents say, they do what their parents do. So if you find that your children are losing their temper a lot, are you losing your temper a lot? If your children lie a lot, do you lie a lot? If your children are using Improper speech. Do you use improper speech? It's the first place you should check. Maybe not. Maybe it's a neighborhood kid. Maybe it's some other influence. I'm not saying it's just you. But children are imitators. So we must be morally qualified. We must remain in fellowship with God through the gospel, between the spouses, with our children, with the world. So that's insofar as it's up to us, be at peace with all men, before we go and take the speck out of our brother's eye, which we do want to do. We don't use this as a cloak for inaction. Number 5, learn when to cover offenses and how to channel kid energy into righteousness and joy. Some things are offensive to you, but they're not sinful. For example, I have a disability where anytime I hear somebody eating something crunchy, I want to murder them. That's the instinct of my heart. I just want to turn and murder them. And it's not reasonable. That's not actually a part of the law of God. You're not allowed to murder somebody for eating Lay's potato chips in your proximity. I know. It's hard to believe. Right? Some things are offensive to you, but they're not actually sinful. My sons are very loud, and there is such thing as disobedient, disrespectful loudness in inappropriate contexts. However, loudness isn't a sin. Being a boy isn't a sin, as much as our public education system seems to believe that it is. You don't need to medicate a boy to make him more like a girl. It's not success. Children are persons, as Charlotte Mason says. We treat them as persons. They each grow with different grain, different knots. So we need to learn how to cover offenses, channel the energy into something maybe more productive. Why don't you kids go play outside in the treehouse? Okay, great. Now they're not in my living room at 115 decibels. Learn to channel it. Number 6, don't discipline primarily for your own convenience or comfort. This one is pretty obvious, but the 4th rule on our list isn't don't make mom and dad uncomfortable. Because parenting them is uncomfortable. Correcting people is work. You have to get up. You have to go do it. You can't just let it slide 15 times. So the law is not centered around your worship, and you need to keep that in the front of your mind when you're disciplining. Am I disciplining my son now because they genuinely sinned and violated the law and I'm correcting them towards Christ? Or am I just annoyed? And sometimes the answer is I do need to go discipline them, but I also need to repent for not disciplining them 5 other times when it just wasn't inconvenient to me like it is now. You keep an eye on the ball there. And number 7, as your kids get older, you need to keep an eye on the way your principles adapt to life via specific methods. So you need to keep an eye on how your principles, like correct according to Christ with respect to these 3 rules, introducing pain that is corrective and unpleasant to drive them towards righteousness. Well, I need to keep an eye on how I apply that to my older children. You're clearly not going to bring the rod of discipline in a spanking to your 27-year-old son who inappropriately disrespects his wife in your presence. You would you'd be sinning. If you're like, okay, son, go in the bathroom. I got a break. Where'd the spoons go? It's been a while. You're blowing them off. You just wail on him a little bit. No. You are still his father, though, even though he's 27 and has his own household. So in a way that's consistent with respecting him and honoring him and not undermining him publicly, maybe the next day, maybe it's a phone call. Hey, son, you talked about your wife in front of us, in this way that it really made her uncomfortable, and that was sinful. You shouldn't do that. Here's why. Let me explain how I learned this. Here's how it's appropriate to talk to your wife. Our older kids need our guidance and mentoring too. 15-year-olds, 16-year-olds aren't going to get spanked, most likely. Very, very unusual scenario where I would say, yeah, it's probably appropriate to spank a 14, 15-year-old. Even our 9, 10-year-old, we're coming towards the end of the season of spanking. 9, 10-year-old, he's still pretty young. We're looking for methods that are still faithful to the principle of simulated pain, small, manageable pain, to simulate the greater pain of his sin, to drive him to Christ. But it's going to be more things like your child needs to have consequences move from simulated. A spanking doesn't actually one-to-one simulate the loss of credibility if you are an unrepentant liar in your workplace, your marriage, etc. Right? So maybe what it is, well, there are these situations where you've been given responsibility because I trust you, that you can be gone on your bicycle for an hour at a time. You can go to the park by yourself, and you've been able to do that for a year because you're older. You're getting more responsibility. I'm now going to limit that, and I'm going to bring that down to the level of when you were 7 because you've lost my trust. The consequence, the pain, is more closely mapping onto the real world consequence for their sin. As they grow, that's the goal. Our goal is that we're giving them freedom and self-direction and authority, along with responsibility, duty, and strength as they get older, so that we can learn how to guide them towards freedom, self-direction, the freedom of slavery to Christ, where they desire that which is good. And so they freely pursue the desires of their heart, which are good because they are trained according to Christ. Psalm 37, delight yourself in the Lord. He'll give you the desires of your heart. Why? Because he will align your desires with his. And so we need to keep an eye on that relationship between the age of our child and the method we're using. So much more that we could say on that front. But let me end here with just a few miscellaneous notes and leave a few minutes for questions here at the end. These are situational and specific and common to our context that are related to discipline, and I think can often be overlooked because a lot of our world is not practicing these. And so we might not have our affections properly trained ourselves. Our standards might not be quite right on some of these issues. The first one is that we need to teach and therefore correct our children in alignment with basic decorum, respect, and manners. Some of these things you might not have grown up in your house thinking that they were that big of a deal. But as Christians, we're not just trying to not do evil, we're also trying to surpass that and do righteousness and love our neighbor. Not just not hate our neighbor, but love our neighbor. People say, I've heard, I can't remember who said this, something like manners are love in trifles. That's what manners is. Like not chewing with your mouth open. Wow, I keep bringing this up. Like not loudly chewing potato chips with your mouth open next to someone in a quiet room is actually just loving your neighbor. Because a lot of people share this disability that I have, right? Not rudely interrupting somebody. Maybe it's not a sin. Maybe it's just, it's a faux pas. Maybe it's just impolite. But we need to make sure that our kids don't grow up to be rude. Love isn't rude, according to 1 Corinthians 13. Politeness to others, deference to their elders, saying yes, ma'am, and yes, sir. These are important things. Looking people in the eye, teaching our children how to have non-completely self-centered conversations. Do you know how many 20-year-olds I've interacted with who had no idea how to have a conversation? And never in a 5-minute, 10-minute conversation will answer every question you ask with a monosyllabic answer. Where do you work? Hill Air Force Base. Are you married? Yes. I just kind of look around like, what is this person interrogating me for? Like, are you a Fed? What's going on? You need to teach him how to have a conversation. One of my friends, who was an elder at the church before he moved, Joe Farley, he would have his kids, especially as they got to 6, 7, 8, 9, he would literally watch from around the corner as they were conversing with adults. And at the end, he'd bring them aside. He'd say, hey, Calland, I noticed that you only asked Pastor Sauvé one question. You need to ask him 3. Remember, that's the target. He was training them to ask someone at least 3 questions about themselves so that he didn't just go, hey, I was playing with my bike the other day. And the kids will just tell you stories all about themselves. Well, if they continue doing that as adults, it's not cute anymore. So we need to teach them basic conversational skills. Looking people in the eye, handshakes, calling adults Mr. Last Name and Mrs. Last Name. I know it's dying. I'm trying to correct this in my own thinking and training, like Pastor Burkholder, not, Dan. My kids shouldn't be calling Pastor Burkholder Dan. It's inappropriate. He's in a position of superiority to them. That's good. They need to learn how to navigate positions of inferiority and superiority. This is the language of our confessions. This is the language of Scripture. Not running hog wild around the church, going up in front during psalm sing, not participating in the singing, making paper airplanes and throwing them at their neighbors during church. They seem cute, but they're actually training our kids to be rude. They're actually training our kids to be impolite, not talking over teachers, pastors, adults, other adults, interrupting, going to someone's house and thanking them for their having table manners, not saying that things are disgusting at the table that they just don't prefer. We're trying to train our kids to say, I don't prefer this, or not say anything at all would be even better. But if you must, I'm sorry, I don't want any of that. I don't prefer onions, right? I'm talking about myself again. Rising before ladies when they enter the room, especially our sons, or before older people when they enter the room, standing up. Oh, hello, sir. Ma'am, would you like a chair? These are simple decorum issues. Dressing appropriately. We're going to talk at length in this with our raising sons and raising daughters about how this works out in sexed piety, but dressing appropriately, not slovenly. Knowing how to dress for church or for school or for public. Not wearing sweats and a t-shirt everywhere. Not dressing like you were in high school, and in high school you were particularly into the goth movement when you go out of the house. Not dressing in a way that's rude to your neighbor just for your own comfort, but not for anybody else's. Not being immodest. Again, we'll talk about that at length. So what this comes down to, the second issue, is just disciplining your children to navigate church environments. We're trying to teach them how to be men and women of God. Men and women of God know how to navigate a liturgy. They know how to worship. So we help our children kneel. We say, we're confessing our sin right now. We're going to teach you how to pray at home. We'll teach you how to sit still. We're going to train in this. We'll teach you how to stand and sing. We're going to learn the songs. I'm going to teach you how to growingly mature in your relationship to the church and to corporate worship. I'm going to teach my kids what each aspect of the service is supposed to be doing, what it's for, and why it's there. And this requires me knowing that. There's some sermon series you can listen to that we've already taught on along these lines, but teaching our children how to navigate, sitting still, paying attention, these are important life skills. Finally, miscellaneous junk drawer issue here is how to deal with parental disagreement around discipline. This is going to happen. Mom and dad are going to disagree. Rule number 1, private, not public. If you, mom, you just spanked the kids, and I think you were doing it in frustration. I'm not going to undermine her and air it before the children. I'm going to wait for an opportunity, or maybe I'm going to create an opportunity where we talk privately, right? A wife might tell her husband, I've noticed that you've been neglecting this. We agreed on this rule that we're going to enforce. You haven't been enforcing it. Did you change your mind? Do I need to, what's going on here? Privately. We need to keep a captain-lieutenant relationship intact. And I don't know if I'm using the correct military terms here, but it seemed right to me. We could also say a general and his deputy, or a sheriff and his deputy, I guess would be better. Where you have a father who is the head of his household. He really has real authority that the wife really does not have. And yet, she is his helper. She is his most powerful deputy. And so he ought not to undermine her and continually change the rules around her and confuse her and undermine her authority in front of the children because I'm the head. Well, no, you are the head, but you're being a bad one. At the same time, ladies, do you ever actually say to your husband when he says, you've been doing it this way, I want you to do it this way? Do you ever actually just say, yes, me Lord? It would be biblical. 1 Peter 3. Or, okay, I'll do that. Without arguing. Is it always an argument all the way down every time? That's not submission. That is not submission. If it's always an argument, if you're never like, yes, even if I think you're wrong, that's where submission actually matters. It's where submission actually matters. Husbands, do you ever actually say to your wife, help me understand why you disagree with my call here? Help me understand. And then listen and adapt or explain yourself. But you should be able to have these conversations calmly, privately, and in love, working together for a common goal, across disagreement, because you're brothers and sisters in the Lord, and because we know how to deal with sin. We're Christians. So there's more to be said, but I wanted to leave about 5 minutes here. I wanted to leave 15, but I talked too much. So any questions on this subject before we wrap up? If there are none, I'll just keep talking.
Brian, what's
yes, sir.
Define light spoon?
Yeah, practically. Define a light spoon. Good question, Mr. Brimley. So what I'm talking about is that it should generally be, there's a reason that the scriptures say rod over and over as a symbol of discipline. It is a symbol. It's also a literal thing that functions as a symbol. It's because using a hand is it's very difficult to not do that in a way that actually causes some simulated pain without just like knocking them over and imparting a lot of force. Because your hand is a heavy thing. A light spoon, a switch, a rod, these kinds of things they can go pretty fast and cause a sting without imparting a tremendous amount of kinetic energy. So you're not going to bruise your child if you give them a light, swift spanking on the bottom. Not over the diaper, which just makes a lot of noise, and the kid goes, "Oh, well, that was nothing. I'm wearing armor." No, it shouldn't be bruising your child, but it should sting. So somewhere in there, and we highly recommend the Amazon Basics Sick Pack of plastic or bamboo spoons. The plastic ones don't break. The bamboo has a better aesthetic, so it's really your call on that one. Anybody else? Everyone's shaking their heads. They're like, but for real, I did buy those like a month ago because the kids hide the spoons. Not even kidding. I suspect. I should say allegedly. Yes, sir, Mr. Jockler.
You're offended when your kids eat crunchy tacos because that might be simple.
You know, the Lord sanctifies, and so I can now be in the presence of a crunchy taco. And my goal is to not make everybody else change around me if I'm really bothered by something, but just to calmly. It's like the toilet paper going on the wrong way thing. It should come over, not under, right? It's the correct way to do it. The patent literally says over. So instead of fussing about it, I've just determined every time I walk in a bathroom where it's the wrong way, I will quietly fix it without fussing. And actually, you know what? It's sanctifying. That small thing, that's how bad I am. That's been sanctifying for me. Did you have a question, Joshua? Or were you just saying, amen, it is correct, it should go over?
One other thing, I do appreciate that you started this off with what is discipleship, and forming everyone, ourselves included, to the image of Christ. One thing I found helpful that kind of plays off that, especially with sons, is to teach them the cool reasons behind why we do the stupid, silly, simple things.
Yeah.
Like shaking hands with your right hand, symbolizing that a warrior was showing I don't have a weapon in my hand.
No sword.
Stand up, present ourselves as a shake with the right, not the left. Why we salute, why a lady with courtesy as opposed to bow. Teaching some of these like really cool.
Yeah.
There's a real reason behind why we do these things that you think are stupid. And as soon as I teach you why this is actually kind of awesome,
Yeah.
now it's no longer an issue. And it's almost a permanent fix because shaking hands is cool.
Yes. We don't want our rules to be arbitrary, even where they're custom, even where they're just custom. There's no Bible verse that says, thou shalt shake your hand with the right hand. However, those are important ways that we're teaching our children about the legacy of their forefathers, the legacy of their fathers and mothers through the ages who have established these customs. And there is a biblical principle to keep in mind here. Don't move the ancient landmark. What that means is, it's not that you can never move a landmark, it's that you should know why it's there before you tinker with it. A lot of times we move ancient landmarks without knowing why it was there in the first place. Why hymnals? Why not screens? Well, there's a reason for that. There's a reason why that's helpful to all learn a hymnal, learn how to navigate it. Why this and not that? These tradition elements of decorum often trace back to meaningful foundational issues of love and respect that will be helpful.